All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
I actually don't think people are users of Ethereum. I think they're users of applications, but also more importantly, they're users of MetaMask. I think the lock-in isn't actually Ethereum. The lock-in is MetaMask. And today, what makes an Ethereum L2 like Polygon easier to use than Cosmos, like Osmosis, is that you don't have to download a new wallet, right? Because you already have MetaMask installed.
All right, buddy. Episode 1. Miles, excited to do this with you, man.
Yeah, me too. I'm, we bring on Sunny and Dmitry. I think these are two of the leading thinkers of the space and just a great way to kick off the season.
So maybe why did we, this is obviously intro to season 1. We're going to be talking sort of big picture, although honestly, the interview did get a little bit technical at points as well. That's part of the good thing about Dmitry and Sunny. But why do we pick these two to sort of kick off the season?
Yeah, I think with Sunny, he is probably, the builder of the most mature application-specific chain in the space right now in terms of Osmosis. And I think he's really been one of the leaders in trying to push this, I would say, reorientation from thinking about decentralized applications, thinking about blockchains really from, an application-first standpoint rather than a chain-first standpoint. And I think we'll hear him really kind of dig into that over the course of the episode. And then on Dmitry's side, he's coming from the perspective of an investor, right? And he's thinking about, okay, if we do believe that applications are going to want their own block space, right? What is the spectrum of the different versions of this look like? What does the end state market structure look like? And I think he's done a great job exploring that in the past.
It's actually always good to get sort of a builder and investor because they're both very smart, but they kind of come at it from different angles. And I think when you get the two of them, you get some pretty special content. Well, this was a fun one. I think without any further ado, let's dive right in. Welcome to the first episode of season 3 of Bell Curve. Very excited to be joined by my new co-host for the season, Miles O'Neill. And we've also got Sunny Aggarwal of Osmosis and Dmitriy Berenzon of 1KX to explore the AppChain Thesis. So guys, welcome all to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Maybe we could start from just, since this is the first episode of the season, just sort of a 10,000 foot view. And Sunny, maybe I can pick on you a little bit here, but if we could even just start with something as basic as, what are app chains when we talk about app chains? And if you had to put the broad contours around kind of the AppChain thesis, why do people sort of get excited about that term?
Yeah, sure. So app chain, it's short for an application specific blockchain. I think what we get maybe to talk about the AppChain thesis before we even go into app chains, I think I have to make a pitch for why applications are valuable, and that then will later lead into why app chains. Why applications are valuable. So in crypto, there seems to have been this prevailing thesis that has been around for the last about 5 years, ever since the infamous Union Square Ventures blog post about it called the Fat Protocol thesis. And it's been around this idea that hey, you can build this generalized L1 and you just get other people to build stuff on top of it, but most of the value accrues to the L1 token. And it's and that's been sort of this primary thesis that's been driving this L1 driven investments especially over the last bull, this last bull cycle where most of the investment flowed into your avalanches and Solanas and stuff, where it's oh, look at these generalized platforms, a lot of builders on top of it. And this is sort of a bet on infrastructure, right? It's okay, if you can build the rails that everything runs on, that's where the value accrues. And this bet has been made before in the 90s, right? Where we're in Web 3 now. If you look at the original web, people were, as the dot-com bubble was happening and the internet was really heating up, people were like, oh, how do you bet on the internet, this growth of this new thing? And a lot of people, were like, oh, well, you bet on the pipes, right? Like you bet on CompuServe and AOL. They're building the pipes that the internet is running on, and as the internet grows, that's where the value is going to accrue. Now, if you look back in retrospect, we have 30 years of background. Looking back now, it's like, no, those actually weren't the right bets to make, right? Like those CompuServe and AOL kind of like died off effectively. Really, the two best bets you could have made in the 90s on the web were Google and Amazon. And those two were applications, right? And like, and the thing is, applications really, in my opinion, are where value accrues. And like, because of a number of reasons, right? They're like much more stickier. And they're non-commoditizable. They have like a direct relationship with users in a way that the pipes don't. And so, today I actually would argue that people aren't necessarily Ethereum users. They're Uniswap users or they're Aave users. And as these applications go multi-chain, or as I suspect will go AppChain, the user's relationship with the actual blockchains will kind of gets like it's intermediated through the applications, and that's why the applications are really where this value accrues. Um, and how this now then relates to the whole AppChain thesis, which is like, look at today now, actually, the two biggest internet services providers are actually Google and Amazon as well, right? Like, you have AWS and Google Cloud, because it turns out the people who build the applications have the best knowledge of what's needed from the infrastructure to build the best applications. And that actually enabled them to build the best infrastructure layers as well. And that's kind of almost a claim of AppChains as well, that by like, the app developers actually know better of how to build proper infrastructure than these like pure infra builders. And that's why these app chains are going to sort of win out. And like, we can design the infrastructure for the needs of applications in a way that generalized blockchains can't. So I know I've talked for a little bit. I'll let maybe someone else jump in with some, but that was a little bit of background on how I see value accrual in blockchains.
I have a different world view of like how to cut it. I mean, I agree with everything you said. I guess to answer the question, like I define an app chain as a blockchain that dedicates its block space to a specific application, which is like a very simple way to describe it. And that definition also is quite broad in the sense that you could consider Bitcoin to be an app chain, or you could consider Arweave to be an app chain as well. I think the concept itself is not particularly new in that like it's been implemented in many ways. I think there have been projects like Cosmos, Polkadot that have generalized that idea, but it's actually been around for a while. I view it also as like a scalability thing and an evolution around realizing that there's a general like with blockchains, there's a product market fit for block space. I think of Blockspace as effectively like a market for trust. And over the years, we've seen more and more demand for these trust minimized markets in a way that no specific instance could scale. And so we've seen that around I guess around like 2020, where you look at super high gas fees. A lot of this we've seen on like Polygon and that kind of prompted the development for other ways to scale. And a very basic idea was that, hey, instead of stuffing everything inside of like one state machine, what if we just like have like very specific like little like pockets where applications could do their own thing. And I think that's like a interesting paradigm. The last thing I'll mention is that I think we're talking about app chains in in the context of like a full stack solution. So just like to frame it, I think a lot of people, when they think about app chains, they think about a Cosmos chain where it's like from like all the way down to the consensus level. I think that also exists along a spectrum. I actually consider like application specific rollups to be an app chain as well. You know, I kind of look at a rollup as like a trust minimized blockchain with a two-way trust minimized bridge. So there's other terms you could start to introduce, and I think we have already too many in crypto, but like a roll app or like an app space concept. So I also want to like talk about the notion of app chains with this idea in mind, where I'm bucketing rollups in that spectrum as well.
Yeah, and I think that spectrum is really something we want to dig into today, and really for the rest of the season as well. I guess for simplicity, and I'll throw this to Sunny first. In the context of a full stack app chain, what would you say are the most compelling reasons to build an application as a full stack app chain? What are the things that you can do when you vertically integrate? And maybe some examples, whether it's Osmosis or other app chains that you've seen, of some of these benefits in action.
Yeah, but I completely agree. I actually, rollups are application rollups are just blockchains that use like different security, like how a security mechanism works is, I think, almost a side concern and when on whether something's an app chain or not. And I think like the way security is going to look even on Cosmos is going to be like very different than it does today, right? Like, as we move towards mesh security and like, validity proof based, like IBC, like, all of this is going to look very different anyways. So yeah, so would someone choose to build an app chain in general? One of the biggest reasons, okay, I think there's different reasons, right? One is, you just want to have more ownership over your block space, right? And that, this is really valuable when you're running on a generalized blockchain. You are basically like competing for that block space, and suddenly a really popular application could come up in which their users are less price sensitive towards gas, and then drive up the price of your block space as well. And like this just leads to a really bad UX. I remember the meme back in like 2017 was like, how are we supposed to pay, like, you can't do your groceries on Ethereum because every time there's an ICO, there's going to be like, your gas price doing a transaction costs $50. Okay, back then it was ICOs, maybe now it's like NFT drops, but there's always these like one-off events that cause random like unpredictable spikes in demand for block space. When you have your own app chain where there's like nothing else happening in that app chain, you don't have these unpredictable spikes that are like out of your control of your application. And the other thing you can also do when it comes to block space gas kind of related things is like do application related subsidies of computation, right? Like there are things that you might want to do in a blockchain, but that like because it's an application block specific blockchain, there are like public goods for that blockchain that are subsidized. So like in example, this is what precompiles in Ethereum effectively are, where like, for example, like doing a SHA hash in Ethereum or verifying a signature in Ethereum is actually that computation is actually subsidized relative to what it actually should be. But it's because it's like, okay, we need to provide this because it's necessary for most things to work on Ethereum. As an app chain, you can make more precompiles for different things. Let's say you are an AMM based blockchain, app chain, which Osmosis is, and it's like, oh, why don't we build a precompile? We have to do this like heavy AMM computation math to like do stuff. Why are we not just like subsidizing this? Because this is like a core part of the protocol. We can actually like make it so we don't actually have to run this in a VM. We can run this as precompiled code. There's all this sort of like benefits you can do there that give you all these benefits on the block space level. So that's like the block space argument for app chains. There's also like, in my opinion, just like the innovation side of app chains, where when you're building a application on a generalized blockchain, you're often very constrained by the limitations of the platform that you're building on, and you have very little ability to change them. Like, here's a new limitation of the EVM that I just encountered yesterday that frustrated me, which is I can't, as a EOA account, I can't send ETH and WETH in the same transaction. These have to be two different transactions. And that was like, this is mind-boggling, right? And it's like, well, on an app chain, I can go change how my blockchain works to go allow myself. I want to be able to do that. I can go change the code to be able to do that. I want to go and a place where like being able to go change stuff at the protocol layer is like very interesting, especially if you're doing like new cryptography, right? Like, I think it's interesting to note that like not everyone, but almost every interesting project that's doing something interesting with privacy is building on Cosmos and building an app chain, right? Whether it's, a Noma, Penumbra, a secret network, like, because you really do need this like sort of low level control in order to like really on the cryptography side of things to innovate. Like just think about how many debates today are time is spent debating on like which EIP is going to get implemented next in Ethereum. And it's like, okay, yeah, this one's going to be slated for 2 years from now. As an app chain, you don't have to participate in these debates because you can just, be like, I'm going to go change my blockchain to do the things I need. And that's sort of one of the big bets of Osmosis is, your Uniswaps of the world are going to be constrained by the platforms they're built on. Osmosis, we don't control just the application. We control the application, we control the blockchain, and it just so happens that our team also builds the Kepler wallet, which is like the primary wallet for the Cosmos ecosystem. So we have this like extremely full stack control that enables us to innovate. It's the Apple thesis, right? Apple's whole take was like, okay, we're going to build the phones, we're going to build the software, the OS, we're going to build the most popular apps. And now they're even going to go build their own chip. Now they are building their own chips and hardware, but their bet is that they can build this like highly vertically integrated stack that provides the best UX and performance to users.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think we can peel back whether this applies at the roll app layer or not. But what are some of the things you can have your validators actually do for you when you control the set? Which is kind of a lot is spoken about the the downsides of needing to bootstrap your own validator set. But I don't think a lot is really talked about in terms of what you can ask your validators to do if they are dedicated to just your application.
Yeah. So a cool thing that you can do is like, yeah, you have this set of nodes with stake behind them that are basically voting on every block. And this actually gives you an opportunity to ask them to add more data along with their votes. And so some of the things that we want to do is like, one of the things that we're really focused on is this thing called threshold decryption. It's an MEV resistance strategy. But part of what makes the threshold, there have been proposals of like, oh, we can add threshold decryption using like meta layers on top of Ethereum. But the problem is like you actually run into all these issues with how you deal with reorgs and stuff. You actually want your validator set of the consensus layer of your blockchain to also be your like threshold decryption set. So that way, as blocks progress, the decryptability of transactions is atomic with finality of blockchains. You can't decrypt a transaction unless it's finalized and added to the blockchain, and you can't finalize a block without having it be decryptable. And so having the same set be doing both of these things is really valuable. Another example of what you can ask them to do is Oracle updates, right? Like, almost not every single one, but I would say a vast majority of DeFi applications today do rely on some sort of Oracle. And for so many of them, we've just come to rely on like Chainlink as our like, okay, this is our Oracle source. But really, that's kind of actually pretty centralized. And more importantly, it's not atomic with block production, right? You have no guarantee that Chainlink Oracle updates will actually enter the chain in a timely manner. Meanwhile, instead, if you had it so your validators were the ones providing the Oracle updates, you actually have a strong guarantee now that Oracle updates are arriving in a timely order. and you can depend on that. So, it's probably not the most popular topic, but this is actually something Terra did pretty well, right? Like there, during the entire crash process, their Oracle worked extremely well, almost too well, and like, and like, and that was possible because of the fact that it was the validators who were atomically providing the Oracle updates during the block production process.
Yep, that one, we don't like to talk about it too much anymore, but that really was kind of the first, example of what we've seen there. I think DYDX and Say are another example where we'll see, off-chain order matching, so you can run the order book actually on the validators themselves. Yeah, and I think we've also seen, especially with Osmosis, a lot of benefits to the UX between custom fee models, custom transaction ordering, and
Yeah.
that kind of also leads to the value accrual side. So not just MEV mitigation, but also potential value accrual. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add there, but
Yeah, I can talk about like so. Yeah, those are good 2 points. The custom fees, I think that's a really important one. One of the biggest, I don't know, pain points I've always felt with almost every blockchain I've interacted with today is like the way that it demands fees be paid in a specific token. I remember like the first time I tried to show a friend how to use Ethereum many years ago. I like made him open a wallet. I sent him some DAI, and I'm like, cool. Now try sending it back, and we realized, oh wait, he can't because he doesn't have any ETH. This is fucking stupid. And so, one thing that we were, and frustrated with this, one thing that we were able to do in Osmosis is we're like, hey, we want people to be able to pay fees in any token they want. We have TWAP prices from our DEX because it's an app chain, so we can use those as a way of like allowing people to pay fees in any token. And that's like, you can do other cool things with fees. You could be like, oh, imagine you have like a specific NFT, you get some sort of fee discount, right? Like you can get really creative with the way that fees work in your blockchain. Or maybe you can be like, oh, if this is a trade transaction, we can allow the swap fee that someone is paying to also like count towards how much their gas fees as well. You can be very creative on this kind of stuff. The other thing is how like transaction ordering works. So like semi-related to like Oracle's, like maybe you want to be like, oh, I want all Oracle updates to go to the front of the block. Your execution layer doesn't have to follow the rules of like what order transactions are included in a block, right? You can be like you can be smarter to actually scan through the transaction in the block, categorize them, and be like, hey, I want to execute them in a different order. So as an example, as a DEX, right? We have liquidity adds, we have trades, we have people removing liquidity from the pool. Maybe what we want to do is like say, hey, okay, first what we're going to do is look through all the transactional block, execute all the liquidity adds first. Then we're going to go ahead and execute all the swaps. Maybe we batch them. And then we're going to execute all the removals of liquidity. This prevents anyone from doing like, rugging of liquidity from underneath a trade. It prevents a lot of like the liquidity sandwiching that's happening because it's like, okay, all liquidity gets added at a fair time. You can actually allow your app layer to be smarter of like how you don't have to just like let the VM, the generalized blockchain, choose the order of transaction. I was at this like retreat where we were talking about a bunch of MEV stuff and like what are MEV mitigation strategies that like Uniswap could build based on Ethereum. And what we've realized after like talking for hours was like there's really not a lot they can do unless they have more control over the blockchain itself.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I think we've covered, whether it's a couple of things under scalability, we have, increased better UX through things like custom fees and transaction reordering and, really user protection. And Dmitry, you also wrote about value accrual in a great piece on AppChains couple months ago. I'm not sure when it came out, but is there anything you want to speak to there on the value accrual side?
On that side, I think if you use the thought experiment of to say like we kind of see it with Osmo, I guess, but if there was like a uni chain, like do they need to turn on the fee switch? And I would argue maybe not if the transaction fees are paid in their native uni token, which also serves as a security model. because that's another implicit way to accrue value. It's not that you need an implicit fee switch. It's that the demand for the application turns, in turn, results in demand for the native token because you need that to actually transact on that chain. So that's like a more crypto native business model that a lot of, depending on the developer, they need to think about. Another dynamic is that a app chain could effectively fork other protocols and monetize within their own ecosystem. I think we've seen some interesting analogies to kind of what Axie did with Ronin, where they have their own DEX, they have their own marketplace. They're able to capture value from the usage of that. And they have users because they provide an application with content that is able to amass like a large like user base of players. So a lot of these DeFi protocols, like it's just code, right? Like you could take what you need, package that into a verticalized application. And as long as you're providing value to your end user, it's a way for you to like keep that like within your ecosystem. I think the last part we kind of alluded to MEV. You know, like I haven't spoken with like the DYDX team. I don't know if they're doing this, but you could have like it's a round robin consensus. You know, like you could have, you know, like if you get every market maker to be a validator on the DYDX chain, that's their business model there too. You know, it's a round robin consensus for like for block inclusion, and so you have a way for market makers to, you know, pay for their like the cost that they have for validating the chain.
So just to kind of sum up, you know, where we are so far, because I want to get into eventually like some of the arguments for why this might not make sense, right? Or what are some of the detractions against sort of the AppChain thesis. But, you know, Sunny, we kind of started with this high level observation that, and this is a dynamic that exists in plenty of traditional markets outside of tech, value tends to accrue to the layer that's closest to the consumer, right? There's that whoever is closest to the consumer, be it an app in Web 2 or like a financial advisor in finance or whatever it is, they tend to have a lot of leverage, right? And then they sort of exert that leverage down the chain. And that implicitly challenges some frameworks that I think a lot of people have in crypto, which again, kind of goes back to that Joel Monegro piece, you know, fat protocols. So if you kind of start with that, then you talk about some of the Dmitriy, I thought you grouped these advantages into three really nice groups, which is sort of performance, which is this idea of like app specific versus general block space, right? Like even like the other side Landmint that shut down Ethereum, not in 2017, but last year, right? So there are still huge challenges for performance in generalized blockchains. There's also value capture, which Dmitriy, you were just sort of talking to. And then there's customizability, which Sunny, you were getting into with basically the advantages of having validators that only are on your specific network. So these are all like huge benefits, right? But walk me through like, what are some of the downsides necessarily of running an app specific blockchain as opposed to like bootstrapping on Ethereum?
Yeah, I could talk to a couple, and the issues that are present today, I guess just to preface, are not insurmountable. I think that there are ways to kind of go about solving some of these, and it is also different within the ecosystems as well. I think the biggest one that comes to mind is like limited composability and making it more difficult to do atomicity across different chains, which is like you want an all or nothing execution of a transaction. I think there are ways to get around that, but it does add some additional like developer friction. There's also a UX friction. You know, if you have if you require a user to bridge funds onto some other chain or some other rollup, I think that is something that we need to solve to make sure that it is as fluid as possible. And I think like the bridging experience today is not particularly accommodating to like new users of chains. Like it's a pretty scary thing for people to do. Another is like the thought experiment. If you use, if every application today, like on Ethereum, were to create their own app chain, and they said, you know what, I only want permissioned write access. I want to control who gets to do stuff on my app chain. How is that different than the world where we came from, where it's like it's permissioned now, and now we're just like recreating that set of permissioning in the for the goal of like value capture and I guess like scalability and all of that other good stuff. And that's like an ecosystem wide question. I don't quite know the answer to like how you balance that. Maybe there's a case that it might make sense for certain flavors of companies, maybe more like enterprisey companies want their more strict permissions on write access, and maybe there's benefits to actually like opening it up for other projects. So that's a couple. I think like the liquidity fragmentation part is also an issue. If you have 10 different AMMs on 10 different like I don't know Cosmos chains or Ethereum rollups, like how does that affect the I guess like performance or like capital efficiency of the system as a whole, and how do you solve for cross chain, cross roll up liquidity pools in a way where you're preserving that experience for end users. So there's a bunch of things there. I guess like I'll stop to see if Sunny has any other things to add.
Yeah, I think that was a really good rundown. I can talk about some of what I see as biggest current issues with app chains, and then we can a little bit about like why what we are doing to help solve those issues. So one of the first obvious ones that I think we actually ran into was for a long time the Cosmos SDK was very like almost anti VM. Right, we were like, oh, everything will be done in the Cosmos SDK and native Go code, and all your app logic is there. And then we realized that there's actually things that people do want to customize, right? Like, every time someone wants to create a new type of multi-sig or something like that, right? Like, there's an argument that app chains aren't extensible enough, right? And like, so what we realize, and maybe other people want to build integrations into your application, right? Osmosis is a DEX. People wanted to build extensions on top of the DEX, right? People wanted to build a dollar cost averaging system, or people wanted to build like a market making vault or something like that. How do you let people build extensions onto your system? And the solution that we kind of came, but was, well, okay, well, first step one was like, okay, well, let's add a VM, right? So there's a VM called Cosmosm. It exists on the Osmosis chain, but it's like, okay, then how do you did we just become a generalized smart contracting chain at that point, right? So I think what the balance that we figured out was actually Osmosis does something a little bit unique in blockchains where we have a smart contracting system, but the uploading of new contracts has to be permissioned by governance. So you have to make a governance proposal to add contracts. So it's like, what this does is it kind of keeps it like an app chain where it's like, oh, okay, we're only going to allow things that extend the functionality of our core feature set, which is the DEX. We're not going to approve in a competing DEX to be deployed on the same blockchain for sure, but we're not gonna, someone wants to go deploy a game or something. It's like, the Osmosis isn't the right place to do that. Go build another app chain for that, or go deploy somewhere else, right? Like we want to focus our thing on keep our block space for like the things that improve the DEX experience. So by having that sort of permission system, that's like one way we've sort of solved that extensibility sort of issue. And another one is like composability. So, Dmitry mentioned like, okay, this like lack of atomic composability between things. And, one thing I push back on is this notion that composability means atomicity or synchronicity, right?
I don't think it does. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, if you look at the web, the web is relatively pretty composable, right? Like you can have APIs that talk to each other, but like all of the web is built off of asynchronous programming, right? Like, the entire web is not running on a synchronous server, right? It's like the entire web is based off of people making asynchronous calls into other services and having callbacks and stuff. And yes, it's more annoying, but it is what is necessary in order to like build any sort of like scalable system. And the composability thing isn't really even, in my opinion, an app chain specific thing, right? Even if you had like many roll-ups or something that were generalized blockchain, you still need to deal with asynchronous like composability, right? If you have a contract on Optimism that's trying to call a contract on Arbitrum, you still need to build in the same asynchronous composability like building blocks. And so I would just say that I think the Cosmos ecosystem, the IBC stack, is probably the furthest along when it comes to building any of these like asynchronous first building blocks. So that's another one. Another big kind of issue that we run into is like standardization. It's almost ironic because like I said, our team actually builds one of the most popular wallets for the Cosmos ecosystem. And sort of part of this whole pitch of AppChains is like, hey, you can come customize everything you want. You want to go change how your staking module works, go for it. If you want to go change how governance works on your chain, go for it. You want to change how transfers and work on or cryptography works on your chain, go for it. But then being the wallet developers, we're like, guys, please don't change too much because like it sucks every time we need to go make a custom integration. And like, oh, you changed the cryptography. Okay, we gotta go build a custom integration for that. You changed the how the staking module works. Okay, well, our staking dashboard doesn't work for that anymore. And so it's like this like tooling based issue is actually sort of one of the biggest challenges that I'm not actually sure I have a great answer for today, and is actually one of the biggest, almost not threats, but big open questions on how we deal with app chains going forward, right? Like you don't want a world where every time someone builds a new app chain that like it's too different than everyone else. Oh, does that mean they have to now go build their own wallet? Or does that mean that like, your favorite staking dashboard doesn't work with it or something like that? So how do you balance these things? I think that's a big thing that does sort of need to be figured out, I would say. I think those are some of the big ones. I have a couple others as well. Security, scope creep, I think is a big issue as well. Like, even Osmosis, it started off as this DEX, but now we have this lending protocol building on top of it. We also have like, a couple other it's like, at what point do we actually start to over evolve and let scope creep turn us away from being an app chain? And like, at that point, what is what do we even mean by app chain when we have this sort of little ecosystem of other projects building on top? So I think that's another big thing that's
like, just to follow up on a couple of those points for so atomicity, atomic composability, one area where it's probably particularly useful is in the DeFi sense around like market efficiency around flash loans. Like that's probably a special thing where it particularly benefits. In the rollup space, I think you might be able to pull this off if you have like a shared sequencer set across like different rollups. I haven't seen that done in practice, and we don't have an example of a decentralized sequencer yet. But I could imagine if there's like a roll up that has an AMM and another roll up that has a money market, and both are the same sequencers, then they might be able to actually like do those transactions atomically. I think the idea around like tooling is super important, because also for a like an app chain needs a couple of components that will let it function out of the box, which could include like a block explorer, an RPC provider, an indexer, an Oracle. To your point, Sunny, you could internalize like some of these things and bake it in, if you have something that's as customizable as like the Cosmos SDK. But if you were to maybe like fork Optimism and just like launch like a rollup, like you probably need to find ways to add those additional components for your like users and developers. So that's like an additional lift around like overall like developer lift that that you need to think about. And I guess a final interesting observation is that like with customizability, it probably depends on the persona of the developer, of like how much composability or customizability do they want or need. I kind of get this feeling that for many developers, it could be overkill to customize like everything. Like maybe it's just a game that wants their game as like the native gas token, and like they probably don't know about MEV, like they don't really care about like transaction ordering. Like that's all they want to, make number go up. So for them, maybe they just want like a more like a simple out of the box solution. And I think like that is probably a UX challenge that needs to be solved for this more like, I don't know, mainstream developer.
I think that makes a lot of sense. We've heard about like the bootstrapping costs. There was one thing I wanted to kind of double click in here, and that was on the permissioning side, because I think a lot of what we've talked about is when you don't have control over your block space, when you can't curate your block space, and you become very successful and you attract a lot of users, you're going to have a lot of random stuff that just starts popping up on your chain, right? Whether it's an NFT project on a would-be DeFi app chain, or a game on a DeFi app chain that takes up all the block space. This can be kind of defeat the purpose in some ways of an app chain. And so would you guys do you think that permissioning, governance, based permissioning is actually a prerequisite to call it an app chain, under the definition of an app chain?
I think it's important to sort of protect the app chainness, especially to protect the block space, especially. Like the other things, maybe it doesn't matter so much. It's almost like a part of the other reason that the permissioning is important, not only to protect the block space, it like protects your innovation rate as well. Because, in my opinion, I think like part of the reason Ethereum development like kind of goes so slow is it has to deal with the interests of the 10,000 applications built on top, and we've had situations in the past where like Ethereum has broken people's smart contracts, right? Like I remember like back in one of the hard forks, like a bunch of the Aragon contracts broke because there was a change in how gas pricing worked. And so it's like, Vitalik gave a talk at ETC this year where he was almost like, oh, prepare to have things break for your developer, your contracts break, which is kind of weird because on one hand we're like pushing for immutable contracts, but it's like, okay, on the other hand we have to be prepared for these contracts to break potentially. And so when you deal with an app chain with Osmosis, before we added Cosmosm, the only people we had to talk to, at least on a contract, on like a builder, on the chain side builders, is like ourselves, right? It's like, okay, we have, is our but and we have to go talk to some integrators, we have to go talk to block explorers and stuff like that. But on the actual chain development side, that we only have to talk to ourselves. Today, if we have to go change something in how something works on Osmosis, right? Let's say threshold decryption comes alive, and but the way that people generate transactions has to change. Today, we only have to go talk to about 20, maybe maximum 20 projects, right? Because like there's only 20 other builders building on top of the Osmosis chain, and that is a feasible thing for us to do, as opposed to like Ethereum, where there's no way for them to like they basically can't innovate because they can't break anyone built on top. And so I think that's one of like the big benefits of the permissioning, is that we protect our uh, liabilities here to external developers.
That's interesting. I, I'm trying to find another argument here. I guess if you look at it from like a free markets perspective, I wonder if you could bake in like incentive mechanisms and actually like the design of the app chain to just like make it either more or less attractive for like other contracts to deploy. Like if you have uh, uh, if you adjust the opcodes to like if you change the pricing in the opcodes to make it like very cheap to swap and like very expensive to do other things, then you've kind of set up your chain to be um, uh, to work better with applications that have to do with that core mechanism. And then you could kind of say, okay, like we're permissionless, like deploy if you want here, but it's going to be really bad for your users because it's going to cost a lot to do the thing that you want to do. So I wonder if you could like get these benefits by having by baking your opinions into like the actual like design of like the block space.
Yeah, so this I imagine will happen actually. So, um, eventually, what we want Osmosis to do is batch all trades, right? Like all trades that happen in a block should be batched together and get equal pricing, which works easily in a world where all trades are executed by users. But in a world where some trades are executed by contracts, things actually get a little bit more complicated and messy, right? Because what happens when a trade, so what we actually end up having to do is we've been thinking about how do we architect a block. Is what we actually have to do is take every transaction that like hit by a contract. We've first run the contract. So one thing that's worth noting is the way CosmWasm is designed is it's actually designed to be asynchronous, non-atomic by default, because it was really designed as a cross-chain contracting system. So it's like, oh, you want to be able to have one CosmWasm contract call a CosmWasm contract on a different chain, almost as easily as it calls a contract on the same chain. But so what will happen when Osmosis implements the batching system is we actually run the first part of a contract. If it executes a swap, we basically hold that swap, run everyone else's contracts, then we take all the dispatch swaps, execute them at the same time, and then we go and run the completion of everyone else's transactions. This is such a different paradigm to like normal smart contracting today, where you expect your transaction to like run beginning to end before going to the next person's transaction. But it's like, no, we're designing the way the block space works to be optimized for what the needs of the DEX is, and it's the responsibility of the things built on top to sort of adapt to that.
I want to get a sense from the two of you, like again, almost like maybe zooming out and looking a little bit towards the future. One topic that we wanted to get your guys' opinion on is this idea that let's with caveating the understanding that there are other communities outside of Cosmos that are necessarily just pushing for app chains, right, as an idea. But we're going to focus largely on Cosmos. And then there are other, layer ones outside of Ethereum that are kind of providing like broad-based security and data availability and all that kind of stuff. But just using those as the two sort of canonical starting points for a similar problem, which is how do we scale and get billions of people using applications and then have them secured and write the appropriate architecture underneath? Like, how do you guys kind of see like just to use these two ecosystems as an example, like Cosmos and Ethereum kind of coming together, right? Like there's a whole bunch of different spectrums of how this might play out, but like, how do you see these two communities like sort of evolving and interacting with each other over the sort of coming years?
Yep. I think from my perspective, it's like an order of operations. I think there's almost like a question that is based on the maturity of the app. I think like an interesting observation that I've seen for DeFi protocols and some others is that on Ethereum, they are launching on L2s first. I think that's an interesting reverse of the operations, because usually a application would launch on ETH-L1 first. Super expensive, but maybe they need like the security, and that's where like the users are. So they would launch their application there, gather some feedback, and then say, hey, like these fees are too high, or we could do more things with their application if like gas fees are lower. Maybe it's cheaper for the Oracle updates. So then they move to a L2, and then if they are successful, then they start to say, okay, we have more users, we need more scalability, maybe we need more customizability. Then what do we do? And in my view, that's where the decision tends to be like very relevant around the crossover, where they might say, hey, do I launch like my own like dedicated L2? Do I just fork Optimism? Do I launch, assuming this is built out, as a L3 on ZK Sync or Starknet? Is that not sufficient? And for a lot of the reasons that Sunny mentioned, like, do I need my own like full stack Cosmos chain? And there are other options too. Like, do I launch my own like Avalanche subnet? Do I go on my own like Polkadot parachain? I think that that decision for teams becomes more relevant the larger they get. And I think like we've seen that with Axie with Ronin and DYDX. I think like as you get more scale. So and like this is a very, I mean, it's probably like more controversial, but like my view of chains for successful Cosmos app chains might be more mature Ethereum based applications that need more customizability, dedicated block space, things like that.
That's kind of an interesting framing because, you know, at the risk of being overly reductive, you could almost view Ethereum as like a launch pad for dApps. And then once you get a dApp with critical mass or whatever it is, and it decides, okay, we haven't really talked about this dynamic of Ethereum being distribution and where the users are as a reason for it being attractive, right? But maybe dApps kind of start there, and then when they get to some point when either the pain of not being able to customize the way users interface with your app, or maybe you just want the economics and you want to vertically integrate, but whatever that like sort of threshold is, you pass it. And the most successful in that paradigm, it sounds like some of the most successful dApps actually end up moving off Ethereum. That actually sounds a little bit, it could be bearish, right? You don't hear people often say something like that, but I don't know if that was the right way to take how you just said that, Dmitry.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure if it's bearish in the sense that they will still have options on a lot of other factors, like for example, security. What are your security guarantees for like your own like settlement layer versus using like ETH-L1 as a settlement layer? Like that's a very important question for potentially like DeFi protocols, and how much are you willing to pay for that security? And even if you do subsidize that with token rewards, is that a sufficient security level that you're getting from Ethereum Blockspace as being like a settlement layer? So I think it's like still very application specific. It might be harder to make that case for like a DeFi protocol that has billions in TVL maybe. But I think your point around distribution is an important one, because if you're going to like a separate island, like you want to make sure you're able to like carry like all these users, that you're providing like a valuable enough thing for them to like move, like to buy that ticket to like go to like the other like to go on the island. So I think like that's why it's a harder case for a lot of applications, because in general I don't think we have like that much critical mass for a lot of users today that actually like transact. We're probably in like the hundreds of thousands, maybe for like DeFi protocols, maybe more for like play to earn games with a certain example of like Axie. But I think we have a long way to go for there to be enough users with any application for them to make the case that, hey, I want to move to like my own dedicated app chain, like off of Ethereum. I think that it's going to be a more and more relevant question over time, but I don't think like it's as clear cut as saying, oh, like I got I'm big enough now, it's time for me to like pack my bags and like go to like a different ecosystem. There's like a lot under the hood like behind that decision.
To the original question of like, so I would say that like, okay, the Ethereum ecosystem versus Cosmos ecosystem is almost like an independent thing of app chains versus generalized chains, right? I think it's almost actually like a quadrant, because within Cosmos you have both app chains and you have generalized blockchains, right? You have app chains, you have Osmosis, you have Stargaze, you have Akash, you have all these app chains, but you also have generalized blockchains like Juno and Terra 2.0 and Archway and Evmos, right? Some of them are EVM based, or there's actually multiple EVM based ones, right? There's Kava, there's Canto, there's actually, so we have this within the Cosmos ecosystem, and then within the Ethereum ecosystem, you also have, let's talk about like rollups, right? You have both generalized rollups, you have Optimism and Arbitrum, and all this stuff. Then you also have application specific rollups. You have DYDX, and you have Loopring and Ronin. I would consider an application specific kind of. A lot of Starkware stuff is really targeted at building, very app chain focused roll up. So, I think this is almost like a quadrant. So, I think we've talked a lot about like the app chain versus generalized stuff. So on the Ethereum versus Cosmos, if you have to like put like, I think there's two sort of main differences here. I would say that we're kind of actually heading towards the same direction right now. I think the Cosmos ecosystem had to pull Ethereum in the right direction a little bit. I think like, today, you have to keep in mind that today, oh, the world is multi-chain. This seems so obvious. 5 years ago when we started working on Cosmos, it wasn't. This was like a radical thing and no one believed us. And now everyone's like, oh yeah, you guys were right. And I think there's other, I think the same thing's going to happen with AppChains. People still believe in these, everyone's like, oh, generalized rollups, multi-chain, but it's like, no, okay, you guys are wrong about that. So I think they're going in the same direction. I think the two big one of the big changes between the focus of Cosmos versus of Ethereum is Cosmos, we kind of took a lower emphasis on the security relationships between these chains and decided to focus our efforts on the application layer composability between these chains. We said that like, you know what, we can bootstrap using sovereign security. Every chain can have its own validator set. Let's focus, and we'll solve that. That problem does need to be solved at some point. How do we scale security? But we can solve that. We have time before we run into the bottlenecks there. Let's focus on like, how do we build really good cross-chain composability? How do you have a contract on one chain call a contract on another chain? How do you have a DEX on one chain, or how do you have like a lending protocol on one chain do liquidations on a DEX on a different chain, right? These are things that, like, in my opinion, the Ethereum ecosystem just has not been thinking about at all. Meanwhile, what the Ethereum ecosystem has been thinking spending most of their mental energy on is on that security relationship side, right? They're the farthest ahead on when it comes on developing validity proofs and fraud proofs and like roll up architectures and stuff. And like I think both sides are starting to work on each other's expertise point. I think maybe I haven't seen too much of it yet, but I'm hoping like people are starting to think a little bit more about composability on the Ethereum EVM to EVM world. I know in the Cosmos world, we're definitely starting to think about security. How do we like scale security? Whether it's going through things like Celestia for data availability, shared security systems. We propose this idea of mesh security. I know in Cosmos we definitely are starting to think a lot more about it. And I guess the thing is one of our uh, exploration points is that unlike Ethereum, where there's like one chain to rule them all, one token at the center of its security system, which is like ETH. Cosmos, there's no one token at the center of it, right? Like this whole mesh security paradigm is really focused around this idea of like, oh, we have all of these many Cosmos chains. How can they sort of like pool their security together? I call it like the empire model versus the NATO model, right? An empire has a single military and it provides security for all of its colonies. While in NATO, you have a bunch of sovereign countries. They all have their own militaries, but they form alliances where they have like, pool their economic strength together to provide like a larger security umbrella. So I think that's sort of like the main difference, I would say, between the Ethereum model of the world and how security works and how the Cosmos model of the world works. Um, yeah. I can also talk about like this the user onboarding stuff, but maybe you guys chat about that. So what I said first so far.
Yeah, no, I think that a big part of this thesis for this season is really that Cosmos and Ethereum are on somewhat of a collision course in that sense, but coming from very different starting points, right? With Cosmos really taking an interoperability at the application layer first approach, and we can start to see the power of things like interchain accounts, right? That's more or less recreating the level of composability that you would see between apps built on the same chain. And then on the Cosmos side, we're also starting to see the introduction of things like mesh security, and the consumer chains that are renting security from the Cosmos hub. I would say, do you see for this future to play out on the Ethereum side, there need to be some equivalent of IBC, or is it more going to be, I think, Dmitry, you referenced shared sequencers between apps that commonly interact with each other. Do you see it, everybody sharing one standard like you do on the Cosmos side, or do you think it's going to be more kind of bottoms up, sector specific sequencer, sets that help, just particular types of apps interop, but, perhaps a gaming roll app on Starkware would never be able to, talk to this sort of DeFi, sector of roll apps?
It's a good question. I think the pace of the Ethereum development makes me think it'll be more like bottoms up like solutions. I think there's ways you could get close with interop. I think like you have like the shared sequencer set is one way to do it. I think using L2s as a settlement layer for L3s are pretty interesting with the use of recursive validity proofs. There's also ways you could potentially...
But that just solves the security problem. That still doesn't, like saying that we can use L2s as a settlement layer.
Oh, so
that doesn't.
right. So one way you could do that. So if you have different L3s post post the data that's needed for the proof onto a shared DA layer, then you could have the L2 use the data from that DA layer to effectively do the bridging. So like one example is like how Slush, like there's a project called Slush. They're trying to implement this on Starknet. So you could effectively use like a shared DA to do the bridging across different L3s, provided like you have like the data. You could also post, if it's like an optimistic rollup, you could post the actual data that's needed for a fraud proof onto a shared DA. You could also do that with an L1. I mean, like that's how implicitly like bridging is done between, say, like two different like ZK rollups. It's using like the L1 as that DA layer. So I think we haven't like really seen implementations of this, but I think that there are ways you could get to sufficiently strong levels of composability, with the exception probably being for atomic composability, you might need that shared sequencer set or like some overlap potentially between, like if you have like a decentralized sequencer set across different rollups.
Do you see actual interoperability providers playing a role here? We'll have, maybe they all share a common standard, but I think, Sonny, you might be familiar with Polymer, right? Who's trying to, kind of introduce the IBC to the EVM side. Do you think that, that reliance on a provider, project like that is something that's scalable in the long term, or is it mainly going to be, based off of the security of the actual roll up itself, kind of like IBC, where you inherit the security of the chain really for the bridge?
Yeah, I think it might depend on if we're talking about like intra or inter. And I think what we've seen recently with like Avalanche, like shipping their own like messaging system, I think chains probably realize this is like a very risky thing, and maybe it's better for users, like Polkadot did this with what was it called, XCMP, like years ago. Like maybe it's this realization, like, hey, if we're within our universe, maybe we should do it ourselves. It doesn't solve the issue of like cross domain, like once you're hopping like between like different ecosystems. I think that's probably where you'll still need like some kind of like third party. In the very happy case, you find a way to do like scalable like client bridges where you're like validating consensus on like every chain that you're like bridging to and from, but that's like not very scalable, and you have
Right.
some ideas around like snarking the consensus and validating like a proof on the destination chain instead of the actual like client. The issue there is extensibility, like how fast can you build this for like all the different permutations, So it's a really tough problem to solve, but I think there will still be a role, I think 100% for third-party bridge providers as it relates to cross-domain interop. And then jury is still out how individual ecosystems, which could include like AL2, like how ZK Sync or how Starknet wants to think about like interop within, or how Optimism Bedrock is thinking about it.
So, guys, you've both been super generous with your time here, and I think as we start to wind down, we've covered a lot of ground. I think kind of talking about this idea of like fat, or I know Sonny, you like to refer to them as tall apps specifically, and where value might accrue. We talked about some of the pros and cons, right, of app chains as opposed to other sorts of architectures, and this sort of collision course idea between Ethereum and Cosmos. Just if either of you guys have like sort of ending thoughts or something that you want the audience to walk away with when it comes to app chains. Could be thoughts about like, where they're headed in the future or even the next 12 months, just anything that you want to sort of bookend the conversation with.
I just want to add one last point about the like user thing that we were discussing a little bit ago as well, about like, all you deploy on Ethereum or on the Ethereum ecosystem, whether that's L2s, because that's where the users are. Like I said at the beginning, I actually don't think people are users of Ethereum. I think they're users of applications, but also more importantly, they're users of MetaMask. I think the lock-in isn't actually Ethereum. The lock-in is MetaMask. And today, what makes an Ethereum L2 like Polygon easier to use than Cosmos, like Osmosis, is that you don't have to download a new wallet, right? Because you already have MetaMask installed, and the process of switching things on the wallet is becoming easier and easier, right? So, this is something, and I think I think that this is something that we're starting to realize in Cosmos. Like, we probably should build better integration support with existing Ethereum tooling that people are comfortable with if we want to make the switching costs lower. So, for example, with Osmosis, like Injective does this, for example. Injective is a Cosmos-based DEX. They don't actually use Kepler as their primary wallet. They actually use MetaMask as their primary wallet. And like same thing with Evmos. And one thing we're working on Osmosis is making it so that you can use, you're bridging assets from Ethereum. You can just start using it with your MetaMask, right? It should feel like any other, like Polygon or any other Ethereum EVM chain, right? Even though it's not an EVM under the hood. So that's like one big thing that we're doing. But that at the same time, we do need to balance this with there's a reason we build our own wallet called Kepler, because we have like views on like how crypto custody is supposed to work and stuff that we don't want to be the same reason that we have our app chain, that we want to be able to innovate at the application layer, at the blockchain layer. We also have our own wallet because we want to be able to innovate at the wallet layer. But I think so it's a little bit of both. How do we get people to onboard with MetaMask and be like, okay, cool, now you're using Osmosis. By the way, if you want to use all the coolest features of Osmosis, you should switch over to using this other wallet instead. But yeah, so I think that fixing that onboarding flow with the wallet will be a big part of like bringing people from Ethereum into Cosmos and any app chain, really.
Yeah, I think on my side, I don't think there's a right answer. I think we've been like researching for that, and I think like the boring answer is like, oh, like there's no one right answer. Like it's not for like every developer, and I think there's a lot of trade-offs, from a developer perspective that they need to think about around like what's your security source, like how do you want to deal with permissioning? Do you need finality? Like what do you want to do with like your gas token? How much composability do you need? Do you need EVM support? And I think like these are all questions that different applications and different developers might answer in a different way. So I think this is all along a spectrum, and I think there's a multi-year play out in the market structure that we're going to see. So I don't think like we have the answers now. I think there's interesting projects coming out that are providing SDKs for developers to launch their own app chains, which could be ZK rollups using Celestia as DA, sovereign rollups, sovereign optimistic rollups that use Celestia as a DA, Ethereum rollups that use EigenLayer as a DA. So I think we're going to see a lot of these solutions come out, and I think we're going to start to get some of the answers just through like observing what developers will do. So I think like it'll be interesting to revisit this in say like 12 to 18 months and actually see like what we got right or wrong about the market structure.
Guys, this has been fascinating. You've given us and our audience a lot to think about. So thank you both for helping Miles and I kick off season 1. And if folks want to find out more about you or follow the work that you're doing, or what's the best way to sort of get more information on the two of you?
Berenzon on Twitter, DBERENZON.
Sunny A97 on Twitter, and you can follow Osmosis at Osmosis Zone.
Awesome, guys. All right. Thanks so much. We'll have to check back in 18 months, see how much, if we sounded smart or way overly optimistic, but I'm feeling optimistic myself. All right, partner, episode 1 in the books. What do we think?
Thought that was great. I thought, I think Sunny did a great job in the beginning of just running through the most compelling reasons to build, an application on an app chain or as an app chain. I think as we'll dig into later, we'll see how many of these benefits still apply when you start to make that, tall app less tall. Maybe it's an app specific roll up, and that only allows you to do, 75, 90% of these things. Maybe it's less. I think that's still pretty unexplored, and also depends a lot on, developments to interoperability and basically the things that kind of mitigate the con side that Dmitriy dug into and covered really well.
I agree with you. It's fun. Like I really liked his sort of opening, even before getting into what is an app chain, having to make the case that applications matter, which is such a funny, caveat to have to include. But I thought his observation was completely right that, Joel Monegro wrote this post, Fat Protocols, Fat Protocol Thesis, a long time ago. Before, at a time when crypto is way less developed than it is today. And I think a lot of the industry implicitly believes that, basically. And that's why you have these large and really engaged communities around Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of the layer ones. And also, to the industry's credit as well, if you were like trying to analyze returns, the L1s have been by far the best performing, asset class or sector within crypto. Even like on Ethereum, the apps denominated in ETH is like down only, right? They basically launch and then it's down.
Exactly. But yeah, framing it in terms of, okay, actually these aren't Ethereum users. These are Uniswap users. These are OpenSea users. These are MetaMask users, right? That's the value of Ethereum, right? Is based off of the amount of activity, and the applications on top really determine how much activity there will be, right? And so as these apps get more users and more traction and more leverage, frankly, to take their users where they want to go, because the apps are the stickiest layer, it will be very interesting to see if these, how many migrate to Cosmos to get more of these benefits that Sunny's talking about, versus how many of them migrate to their own app specific rollup or maybe sector specific rollup. But really, reframing the conversation back to the applications and back to where the users are. I think that's kind of the whole point of this season, right?
I would even call it like it's a reorientation in a lot of people's minds, right? Which is like this sort of, maybe you were starting from this point that you didn't even realize, which was, oh, these are the rails and value's going to accrue here, and then there'll be some interesting apps, to like ultimately people use apps. And you're right, that phrase that Sunny used right at the end there, I love the way he framed that, because it's actually how I've felt as being a user in DeFi. And for those of you who are listening, Miles has been in some ways my sort of guru shaman, sherpaing me on my own on-chain journey, and you've helped me a lot. But I've had the feeling when I'm using these apps, like this is not the end state here, right? Like me messing around on like Ethereum main chain is like not what we're building towards here. I'm not the natural user of this, right? So
right.
I totally agree. You want to use an application, be it a game or an NFT or something that doesn't even necessarily exist yet. But, the way people operate and view themselves as an ETH user, and you're doing all this stuff, that's not going to be the end.
Yeah. And I think today still there are far more users of centralized, right, crypto services than there are of decentralized crypto services. And I think, Osmosis' stated mission is to build the Binance on-chain, right? And in order to recreate that user experience, the performance, that is the reason why they're building as an app chain. They think that it is, and also user privacy, all these little things, right? And so I think that reorientation is really helpful in understanding why anybody is building as app chains when ostensibly they kind of live on an island and make people jump through a bunch of hoops at the moment just to onboard. But the best version of them probably is the closest thing we can get to these centralized products, but you don't have to deal with all the trust of centralized products.
And one word that we didn't really use during that interview, but you and I sort of use in a somewhat joking way, but it's kind of this idea of like product maximalism, right? There's been no shortage of maximalism in crypto, but usually that centers around like an L1 ecosystem like Bitcoin or ETH or something like that. Whereas this kind of, and Cosmos, I think, even though they don't really call it this, they sort of pioneered this idea, right? Which is like a relentless focus on the product and the user experience. And I think that's going to be a theme that's going to run through, hopefully all of these episodes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where you and I are coming from. We don't have, any ideological bias about which chain it should be built on. We frankly don't care. We just care that there are, products that people actually want to use, and that's what's going to drive, the mass adoption of decentralized applications.
If you start from that kind of that high point of product maximalization, ultimately we want apps that hundreds of millions, eventually billions of people use. Then underneath that, right, there's a whole bunch of things that need to happen, right? You could call it kind of the architecture of like an app chain underneath, or you could call it the security model. But ultimately, if an app is very focused on kind of the execution environment at the top, then there's like data availability, there's consensus, there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to happen underneath. And that was sort of where we were getting into the Ethereum approach or starting point versus the Cosmos starting point.
100%. And that's really where the spectrum also that Dmitry was talking about plays out, right? Because at the end of the day, I do agree with this definition of an app chain is just, an application that owns its, has dedicated block space, and it can curate, right, that block space and optimize it for its own application. And I think there's going to be a lot of different flavors of these app specific environments. And that's, peeling back kind of the current trade-offs to each specific flavor of it is something we can dig into this season, and also thinking about, okay, in 1 or 2 years, based off of what's being developed to kind of mitigate some of the trade-offs of that, what could this look like, right? And so, yeah, I think we'll further explore that as we go on the season.
One thing that was sort of stuck out to me, was this idea that capture happens not at the Ethereum level, but at the MetaMask, at the wallet level.
Yeah,
so
right.
Jason's been really digging into this idea of like the wallet wars. And actually, It's funny because I can remember when I was first getting involved in crypto, it was the rollover of the 2017 bubble. So everything was going to be useless. But the two things that people were very bullish on was custody and wallets, which is kind of the same thing, right? But like, one of those ended up playing out big in like BitGo and Anchorage, and you sort of saw the rise of these like institutional custodians. But the retail wallet, it like never really took off, like maybe because bear markets are not a period of time when a lot of new retail users sort of come in. But it always kind of amazed me that, like the wallet level is so critically important and doesn't get a whole lot of airtime.
No, and something we haven't really talked about, because we've been talking about, vertical integration going down from the application level, but, we'll see with Uniswap and to some extent with Osmosis already, right? Applications that also want to own the wallet. And how does that, I guess having a, better ownership of the customer, right, by owning the wallet and the touch points, how does that play out against the friction of, making the user create a new wallet? How many do you basically have to own those customers to begin with, right? Or else you're adding another layer of friction that just might be too much. And so, we haven't really talked about, vertical integration going upwards, but that's something to, definitely explore as we chat about it with more folks on the season.
When it comes to vertical integration as well, there's like two sort of big benefits to keep in mind that we kind of like touched on both, but just like highlight it for people who are listening. There's the economic reason why you'd want to vertically integrate. You want to be able to, extract more fees basically from every layer in the stack. But then there's also, and it seems like this is more important to Sunny, which is you want to be able to control every part of the user experience, right? From like the wallet to the exchange, etc. The downside of that, right, is that it's more surface area for governance. I know is a point that you've made.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't really get into that as much today, but I think we did get into the permissioning side, right? Which is great because you can curate your own block space, and it's still decentralized because it's through governance. But to Sunny's point, what happens when governance decides that they no longer just want to be an app chain anymore, right? And you start to get into some challenges around scope creep. And I thought Dmitry brought up some really interesting examples of how, you might be able to abstract that away from governance, or, ossify this sort of, curation into the protocol's dynamics by treating fees differently for different sort of chains. So I thought that was another very interesting piece because, the scalability of governance is definitely a big question here.
Sunny at one point drew his like quadrant, right? Like his quadrant example, which I think, and now, something is kind of clicking. Before, we recorded this, had a talk with Dmitry, and he was describing like how he thought it was appropriate to basically call it app space. And I think a way that I'm now kind of thinking about this is there's like generalized blockchain space and app specific space, right? And like that's actually a more, because there's so many words now, dude. There's like roll-ups and roll-apps and L2s and L3s. Right. And like, honestly, maybe the most appropriate delineation is just like how far away you are from the settlement layer, and then whether or not it's specific dedicated to one specific app type space, and then, or general sort of blockchain space.
Exactly. Because you couldn't say like Cosmos is just app chains, right? Because, to Sunny's point, all these things exist, and that's that life cycle, I think, is where for every application is where this becomes very relevant, right? So at what point are you in your own life cycle, and where does it make sense as a starting point based off of that? Is it on a general purpose, L1, any sort of smart contract platform, general purpose L1, L2, right? And then as you grow, are you going across that spectrum and getting closer to having your own dedicated app space, and then maybe expand vertically even more with your own app chain? But yeah, I did like that spectrum, or I guess the crosshair between general purpose and app specific.
You pulled out a super interesting point in that as well, which is the permissioning argument. That was when Dmitriy kind of framed that as like, okay, so it's all very well and good to say, oh, this specific block space is for this app, but how do you actually enforce that, right? Because people might, you might, as the creator, right, of the block space, you'd be like, I want to only use for this specific thing, but in a lot of senses permissionless, so people could just start using it for other things. And how do you enforce that?
Exactly.
Interesting question.
Kind of defeats the purpose. And I think just to touch on it again, I see three general approaches here. There's the governance, gating, from that permissioning of contracts and permissioning for chain upgrades, obviously. There's sort of implicit gating that we were talking about just now in terms of treating, maybe disincentivizing certain types of activity with higher fees. And then there's, of course, just, I would say almost enterprise, roll-ups and like we see this with like SoRare or, some of the other StarkNet roll-ups, that this is basically one company that's saying, okay, you're getting most of the benefits of security from Ethereum because it is a ZK roll-up. But at the end of the day, right, we're kind of in charge of this. And you're coming here for a specific reason, right, to trade NFTs or, to trade on DYDX. But how important will it be for them, to actually decentralize that sort of permissioning? And just how effective is it through governance versus other ways?
All interesting questions.
Yeah.
Anything else that you found particularly interesting you want to highlight? Or
I think that mainly covers it. I think we're going to dig into the interoperability piece quite a bit more over the course of the season, because I think it's mainly a question of, okay, if you see this is kind of the direction Ethereum is heading, what needs to be built in order to get there? What sort of standards need to be established, right, to enable that same sort of async composability that you get with IBC on Cosmos? Is it, going to be a top-down approach where Ethereum says, okay, you're going to have this built-in standard, like we talked about, or is it going to be bottoms-up, where you have, maybe applications that know they interact frequently with each other are going to, kind of have the same sequencer set, right? So it's a little bit more frictionless, but very much so within just a little sector of apps, and no one shared standard like you see on the Cosmos side.
And for folks, we know this was like a slightly technical episode, but one way that helps my 5-year-old brain understand standards, right, is you can have, there are all sorts of different cars out there, right? Like, tens or however many different car brands are. You could go to any auto shop and they know how to change your tires because there's an agreed upon set of standards in the automotive industry, right? That you don't vary by, use, a couple different sets of screws, or it could be a couple different sizes, but ultimately, like, that's what makes that work, right? So that basically unlocks, auto repair shops and aftermarket businesses and all this kind of stuff. So that was what Sunny was talking a little bit about. It's like, hey, we haven't agreed on any sets of standards. So we, as the developer of Kepler Wallet, everyone's trying a whole bunch of new innovative stuff, but it's like, guys, we need to there needs to be guardrails around it,
Right,
essentially.
right.
So,
and that will need to be an application, based push for Ethereum, right? Which it's not been kind of the typical course of development for Ethereum. They've not been building just to cater to a certain set of apps, but I think that we could see that change as the apps, gain more leverage over, I guess, the chain itself, right?
you know what else is funny? Just in close, this is so much in crypto gets reduced to like a technical argument, but also a huge component of this is just different communities and their priorities and like the culture that gets set. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
100%.
Cosmos as a community just focuses on this, right? And the leaders who are in Cosmos, actually, it's almost too bad we didn't get this. Sunny made this point after we, left, but there's a big difference within the Cosmos community of the core devs also being application builders versus in Ethereum, the core devs and are completely separate, right? So that is a cultural thing, right? There's no technology that makes that the case, but like that's a huge cultural difference in between. It's just funny to pick apart.
Maybe just to give a sense of what he was talking about there. This would be the equivalent of, if the next EIP for Ethereum, the next major Ethereum upgrade was really developed by, say, the Uniswap developers, the Aave developers, the MakerDAO developers, right? Those application developers are the ones really dictating where the base layer goes and what standards they introduce. That's definitely not the case today. And in fact, they really try to separate each other out, not to give any application some sort of special privilege. But I think, it's a big question to see if that will change over time.
All right, buddy, this has been a really fun one. Just to give you guys a sense of what we've got coming up in episode 2, we're going to be talking with Sam Hart and Zaki Manian about, we called it fat apps. Maybe we should change it to tall apps and aggregation theory, but getting into even more detail about this idea that value may accrue at the app layer as opposed to, further down the infrastructure stack at the protocol layer. So this has been a fun one. And yeah, buddy, I'll see you next week.